listening to Backchat. Call us on 233-88-266 and have your say.
Welcome back to Backchat with me, Azam Khan, and Mike Rouse. 12 years on since its inception, the Belt and Road Initiative has grown to impact 3/4 of the world's population, represent half of the world's GDP. As Beijing pushes for multilateralism and free trade, foundations like the BRI are becoming more crucial than ever. So what's the next evolutionary process of the massive venture? A virtual conference was recently held by the Global Institute for Tomorrow with nearly 700 participants from over 40 countries, titled One Belt, One Road, What's Next in the New Multipolar World Order? And we're joined on the line now by Chandran Nair, founder and CEO of Global Institute for Tomorrow. Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. Good to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about it.
Yeah, thank you. Always a pleasure to speak to you. So can you just give us a little bit about, given this shifting sands of geopolitics, can you just talk a little bit about the Belt and Road Initiative being more crucial now than ever?
Well, rather than say what I think, I'll perhaps for the audience share some of the key points made by the people who we invited to speak last week at the forum, the virtual conference. And I think the things that stood out for me, 3 points, but there were many points being made. And we have people from Africa, Middle East, Europe, Asia, China, Pakistan, etc. And these were both academics as well as think tank leaders, etc. We left out the politicians and the journalists, given that they might be colored by ideological biases. I think the things that stood out for me was the point being made, particularly by the person from Pakistan and Nigeria, that infrastructure is key, and the academic from Beijing University, who's published many books. And anyone's interested, they go to the website and find out who all the speakers were the other day, and also full recording. Infrastructure is key, and that probably a lot of people say this, but infrastructure that is attuned to the present needs of the country rather than simply aspirational. You see what I mean?
Right,
so
yeah.
Chinese academic said that the difference between the Chinese BRI and what was the old method of investments, etc., was the view that you ought to be like us, a sort of Western aspiration of where you ought to be, to build this infrastructure now. Whereas he, an academic who's looked at it very carefully, said, you don't have to look ahead 50 years. You have to look at basic needs now and what's that infrastructure. As you do that, jobs are critical. So he really emphasized that's been the Chinese model of jobs. The second point that was made by the Pakistani person on the panel, who said that it's really important to focus on, firstly, giving people access to capital. That there's a massive global financing gap. We had the former head of HSBC's BRI initiative in the Asia Pacific, who as a banker is extremely well-versed, and he said the gap is massive. What BRI did, and the Pakistani representative spoke about this, immediately provided Pakistan with capital they had never seen before. So there's a lot they had to do to handle this. But this is stuff we never hear about. And he went into the details, even cited reports what could look at. But the financing gap is huge, and BRI enabled them to get access to capital, which they had never seen before. So they had to build capacity to deal with that, etc. But at the same time, he referenced specifics about, energy utilization, roads, transport, trade, etc., that it helped fulfill. The other point I would make that was very interesting was, I think at least 4 of these 6 speakers talked about the fact that the whole charge about, debt, that it was a debt trap, etc., was debunked. And most effectively by the professor from Nigeria. Right. And we've had this before in part of our series, which is not to do with the Belt and Road. This last week was the first of this year's series, but we've done this for 2 years before. So we've had quite an interesting amount of people from different parts of the world giving very sound data, and the reports are out there, But if you follow the mainstream media, mainly the Western media, you think this is a debt trap like nothing before. But they gave numbers that suggest that it is not, and it's only, the financing is not just debt financing either. So those are the main points I would make in terms of the, what I learned that was most useful from what was discussed on
It's interesting how the Western media seem to have bought into quite an aggressive narrative against BRI. It's not even neutral, is it? It seems to be negative.
Or they don't talk about it at all, like Chandran said.
Well, now they don't talk about it because other events in terms of the wider, what I say, insecurity in the West to deal with a shifting multipolar world. So we've seen the insecurity that is the U.S.-led war against the world, as I called it, with tariffs, sanctions, etc., which is the insecurity of the rising out of an inability to share with the rest of the world. Europe is slowly beginning to realize that game is over. So BRI is no more a focus, which is in many ways a good thing. And the point of the conference was to get people to hear from academics, not politicians, think tank heads from different parts of the world, what's going on in the ground and the issues that need to be dealt with. So I think the Western media has lost interest because in a way it's, as you said, the numbers are over 140 or 50 countries, 75% of the world's population, 50% of the GDP.
It's good that you also mentioned the debunking of the debt trap. Even Bloomberg has done a comprehensive thing that has also debunked it. But it's so interesting because every nation has their own unique and distinct situations, right? Like with Pakistan and, like you said, the troubling of having access to financing. So that's something that the Belt and Road also has to deal with, right? Like every country having its own unique economic realities.
Every country has different needs, and that came out very clearly. The Africans talked about that, the previous infrastructure built during the colonial era, also in India, was essentially to take raw materials to ports. And the Africans now talked about that there's so much infrastructure. It's not about a train or a road from a mine to the port and then a port being built to ship resources. Having said that, and one of the things we try and do in organizing this is we don't try and get people who are just one way or the other biased. We want people who are willing to share openly and have a balanced, dare I say, scholarly discussion. And it's not all plain sailing as well with the Belt and Road. So a couple of things that came up. The African speaker spoke about how much the Belt and Road had helped, but there was a need to now go up another level. And one of the things he spoke about, and the Chinese professor from Beijing University provided some good insights and acknowledged this is the next step. And one of the things he talked about was now the need to counter the issue that some of the Belt and Road initiatives are not providing enough for Made in Africa, if you see what I mean. So the accusation that it could be thrown was that it's still offshoring Chinese need into and using raw materials. So one of the things that needs to be done is raw materials, and the Chinese academic emphasize, if you have raw materials, then use it effectively. But at the same time, for China and initiating the BRI, it shouldn't be seen as, well, we're not coming now with guns and missionaries to take your raw materials. We're actually going to do a deal with you. But even that needs to go a step further so that Africa actually has Made in Africa. So as we all know, that means, value-added industries being added in terms of metal extraction, etc. So there's a lot to be done there. This is discussed and openly acknowledged. The next phase needs to be all of that.
It needs to be taking and using those raw materials to produce products in those countries themselves.
That's right, and labor and providing jobs as well. So, one of the accusations quite often, even in Southeast Asia, is that China does this, but there's too much Chinese labor. I think that is beginning to stop. Even in my own country, in Malaysia, there were suggestions that it's too much Chinese labor, Southeast Asia, Cambodia. So that is beginning to change. But that's the easier one to fix.
Right.
The more important one is the investment in then the next stage of essentially producing goods and adding value, whether it be metal, raw materials like agricultural produce, etc.
And moving up the value chain, increasing
absolutely.
quality.
That's right, absolutely. And creating jobs that move from the basic jobs to the next level up. So providing economic mobility to local populations rather than the usual FDI, build a factory,
Yes.
everyone's got a low-level job and nothing else changes.
They could be training, so the Chinese now could be doing more training, right? Training and services in that regard to help build up the ability to be...
Absolutely. Training is going to be very important. And a point that was made by many was, of course, given all the rhetoric in the world today about green, 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 that the Chinese are pretty focused on bringing in green technologies. But green technologies is not enough. You need to look at whether your intervention in the economy is also creating, for instance, ecological harm on a large scale. If you're building a port, if you're helping develop a mine, etc. So the technology needs to be green, but there's the first principles of looking at damage. And I know of several things going on, and I've spoken about this at conferences hosted by China Daily and in front of policymakers in China, etc. And I've written about it. China needs to be very careful that as part of the BRI, it's not seen to be saying, yes, we are doing green technology. Same time, the infrastructure, etc., does do undue damage. Now, let us face it that in all our countries that have developed, there is a tension between development, putting in infrastructure, and environmental encroachment.
Right.
They're still running away from that. But China has to be ultra careful because everyone's watching, and it's a big and powerful player. So I think this is very important as well.
But Africa has the potential to be a huge producer of environmentally acceptable energy in terms of solar and so on.
Absolutely. So Professor Rana Mitter, who is a former professor at Oxford and now currently U.S.-Asia relations at Harvard, gave a keynote at the end, which I would also, encourage everyone to listen to at the end of the 2.5 hours, about all the geopolitical tensions and particularly the energy nexus that we're being confronted with.
Right.
10 years ago or 5 years ago, before AI became the flavor of the month for everyone to talk about, we were already pretty clear if the rest of the world was to uplift the majority of its people out of poverty, we would probably need 50% more energy than that we are using today. Given the existential threats of climate and everything else related to our dependence on fossil fuels, that was going to be a massive challenge with technology investments, etc., and we needed to divert from fossil fuels. But now, in the last 2-3 years, it has become very clear the love affair with AI has taken us into a very, very interesting, I would say, twilight zone. AI is predicted to possibly consume, in the next 30 years, as much as 75 to 80%, depending on who you listen to,
Wow.
of all energy needed on the planet, right? With the data centers, etc.
Yeah.
There might be tech breakthroughs which will reduce it, and that's where China is leading to. But if you add that amount of energy, and you leave aside just the basic needs of people in the developing world to need more energy, we're in a whole new area. So the question I asked Professor Rana was, in that sense, what should be the new focus of the BRI? In my view, it has been very much focused as well on infrastructure and energy nexus. What sort of energy? And can China, working with Africa, as you said, and Southeast Asia, dare I say, which will have about 1 billion people, be at the cutting edge of development, which is all dependent on energy, but which is not as wasteful and takes us away from a trajectory where if you put those numbers together, it points to catastrophic collapse, in my view. So we have to think about it differently. So I think BRI's next 10 years, in my view anyway, has to ask these questions,
Yes.
invest together with those countries in addressing these tensions.
And what you said, I think, is the philosophy underlying BRI seems to be very different from the old Western aid philosophy. And what you said about getting the countries to move up market, turn some of their materials into high quality products, it's going to increase tension, isn't it, with some of the Western model?
I think that tension has already peaked. In terms of the practical stance, I think that has peaked. The West can't do anything about it. Flows are all being halved. So it doesn't have its financial clout anymore. And that's why we've had this growing global financial gap in terms of the ability to influence. But ideologically, unless we have better discussions like the one we tried to post and give people information, it will continue to play through these media outlets this view that, these Chinese and these other countries are all lackeys, etc. It will continue to do that. So one of the points that was made by both the African journalists and the Pakistani was that the Chinese are not good at PR. And I said that too. And I think this is very important because they don't believe in PR. They didn't invent advertising. That was a unique American invention, right? How to get you to buy things you don't need, which are not good for you. But it was very strongly made, a point was made by our Pakistani panelists that the Chinese don't know how to sell the BRI better. And we discussed the need for not propaganda, but better information so that people actually know what is being done.
Right. So
everyone learns from that, because as I said, it's not all smooth running. But one thing I would say is the tensions are there, and it's geopolitical. So geopolitical interference is huge.
Yeah.
So we had a member from Sweden who's of Iraqi origin, very closely
Hussein Askari. Yeah, he's brilliant.
And he spoke about how all the oil sold in Iraq is still controlled by the Americans.
Yes.
Therefore, that you can't do much. But at one point I raised with the Professor Rana Mater in his closing remarks, I said, we had a panelist who talked about China's investments in BRI, Pakistan, which are improving the lives of hundreds of thousands and millions. But it then becomes the source of tension between China and India, right? So, the relationship between China and India is actually extremely important. In my view, one of the most consequential foreign policy sort of relationships of the 21st century, because then it all sort of comes together. Because Pakistan, although most people see it as, a very troubled place, is going to be an extremely important country with about 350 to 400 million people.
Yes.
So this is very geopolitical, but to your point, Mike, it's no more the ability of the West to subvert through holding back money, etc. It's more propaganda and geopolitical relations, which are leveraged.
In the past, China's focused on building these realities on the ground rather than selling them.
That's right. That's very true. So, the Chinese professor from Beijing reminded us that the BRI, as you all know, is the cornerstone of the Chinese foreign policy. And he reminded us of the 5 pillars: connectivity, which is more than just internet connectivity, it's connectivity between nations, and that includes infrastructure, policy, relationships, and sort of aligning policy, but also respecting policy boundaries between different countries, trade, which is the easier one. I think World Bank studies suggest that trade flows will improve in more than 155 countries because of the BRI, so anyone can go and check the World Bank report. Trade, but culture and finance. And I think most of the speakers acknowledge that today the focus is really on trade and finance because of the financial gap. Policy is coming in. Infrastructure is being built, and those are the most important. But infra, much more needed, much more expensive, but that is being built, but not just to extract infra to add value the economies, upward
Right.
mobility, but don't, do moonshot ideas because, we have this in Germany, so you need to have this too. No, start with the basics.
Yes.
That was a very strong message.
Chandra, I'm afraid we're just about out of time, but thank you so much. It's such a vast project, so thank you so much for explaining that in detail. Chandran Nair, founder and CEO of Global Institute for Tomorrow, talking about the Belt and Road Initiative.